Chapter 1. The World After Everything Fell. Hey guys, tonight we begin with a quiet ruin. The torches have gone out, the cities are hushed, and the gods, well, they've stopped answering letters. So, dim the lights, settle under something warm, and let's drift back to the year 1200 BCE, when the known world decided to collectively forget how to function. It's the Bronze Age collapse, a polite little apocalypse where everyone failed at once, economically, politically, and, frankly, emotionally. Let's take a deep breath, because for about 300 years, things had been going weirdly well. Across the eastern Mediterranean, powerful kingdoms strutted around with shiny weapons and shinier egos. There was the new kingdom of Egypt, bossing the Nile like it owned the place, which, to be fair, it did. There was the Hittite Empire, up in Anatolia, hammering bronze and making enemies. Then you had the Mycenaeans, those pre-Greek people who built palaces so big they forgot what rent was. And in Mesopotamia, there were the Kassites, the Babylonians, and the ever-tired Assyrians, all doing bureaucratic paperwork in cuneiform like their lives depended on it. Because, of course, they did. The Bronze Age world was a network, a cozy web of trade, diplomacy, and passive-aggressive letters written on clay tablets. Egyptian pharaohs wrote to Hittite kings like pen pals who might declare war at any moment. Ships sailed the Mediterranean, trading copper, tin, ivory, gold, and occasionally each other. Everyone depended on everyone else, which, as history likes to prove, is an adorable way to guarantee disaster. Let's imagine the scene around 1250 BCE. The port of Ugarit, in what's now Syria, bustles under the morning sun. Merchants unload amphorae of olive oil, baskets of purple dye, ingots of tin, and the occasional angry goat. A scribe sits nearby, grumbling about taxes while pretending not to notice that half the trade officials are bribed. Somewhere inland, Hittite soldiers sweat under bronze helmets, while their king, Suppiluliuma II, stresses about wheat shipments. And in Egypt, Ramesses II, that Ramesses, the one with the statues and the ego, parades through Thebes like a man who thinks he'll never die. Spoiler, he does. Eventually, everything looks solid. But that's the tricky thing about civilizations. They look the most impressive right before they collapse. Because while palaces gleamed and temples thrived, the whole system was built on fragile interdependence. Bronze itself needed copper and tin, both imported, often from hundreds of miles away. A drought in one region meant fewer harvests, which meant less trade, which meant no bronze, which meant, well, fewer people with swords to protect the people hoarding grain. Somewhere between 1200 and 1150 BCE, the dominoes began to fall. No one really knows where it started. Maybe a climate shift, maybe an earthquake, maybe everyone just collectively decided they'd had enough of palaces telling them what to do. But by the time anyone noticed, it was already too late. Let's float north to Anatolia first. The Hittite Empire, once fierce and bureaucratically enthusiastic, began to crumble like a stale honey cake. Their capital, Hattusa, sat behind colossal walls, carved lions glaring out as if daring anyone to invade. But even lions can't fix logistics. Crop failures struck, trade routes dried up, and the royal court dissolved into chaos. Letters from the last Hittite kings read less like royal decrees and more like the desperate emails of a CEO realizing the company's about to fold. By around 1180 BCE, Hattusa was abandoned. Its temples emptied, its archives silent. The empire, 1,000 years of organization, vanished so completely that when archaeologists rediscovered the ruins in the 20th century, they had to argue over which civilization it even was. Meanwhile, down in the Levant, cities like Ugarit, Byblos, and Ashkelon were having their own bad week. Ugarit, once wealthy and confident, started receiving panicked messages from nearby allies. One tablet, found half-baked in the ruins, reads, "The enemy ships are here. Our city is burned. They did evil things in my country." That's not something you want in your inbox. The letter never reached its recipient, by the way, probably because the courier was busy running from the same enemy ships. Those ships, whoever they were, are now famous as the Sea Peoples, the historical equivalent of a group chat full of chaotic energy. They appeared seemingly out of nowhere, raiding coasts, burning cities, and ruining everyone's year. Egypt called them northerners from all lands, which, as descriptions go, is both unhelpful and kind of poetic. Egypt itself, the grand old survivor, held on a little longer. By the reign of Ramesses III, not the famous one, but the one who tried, the empire was a tired old lion. Ramesses faced the sea peoples in 2 major battles, at the Nile Delta and elsewhere, and actually managed to win. His reliefs show rows of defeated foreigners and triumphant Egyptians, always convenient propaganda. But behind the chiseled glory, Egypt was cracking. Wages went unpaid, grain shipments faltered, and workers at Deir el-Medina, the artisans who built royal tombs, staged what is arguably the first recorded labor strike in history. Their complaint? They were hungry. And when the people carving your pharaoh's tombs stop showing up, that's not a good sign for the afterlife or the economy. As Egypt limped on, the rest of the eastern Mediterranean slipped into a quiet, eerie dark. The Mycenaean palaces in Greece, those grand, beehive tomb-building, linear be-writing centers of power, burned one by one. Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, each torched and abandoned. For centuries afterward, Greece basically forgot how to write. Literally. The script disappeared, along with the bureaucracy that needed it. When literacy returned in the following Iron Age, they had to invent a new alphabet. That's how bad it got. Across the sea, in Cyprus, artisans kept trying to hold the line. They had copper mines, precious stuff, and were used to selling it to whoever could afford it. But as trade collapsed, the market vanished. People started burying their treasures, bronze weapons, gold cups, fancy jewelry, just hiding them in pits and never coming back. Archaeologists love these hoards. They're like time capsules of collective despair. But at the time, they were a sign that everyone expected the worst. Let's drift over to Mesopotamia, where the Assyrians were watching all this like exhausted neighbors. They survived the collapse better than most, but even they struggled. Their records complain about famines, rebellious vassals, and refugees, waves of displaced people fleeing chaos elsewhere. Imagine thousands of families moving through already drought-stricken lands, searching for food. That's the Bronze Age version of a global recession. So, what actually caused all this? Historians, being the curious but eternally indecisive species they are, have debated it for decades. Some blame climate change, droughts recorded in pollen samples and sediment cores. Others point to earthquakes, especially along the Anatolian fault lines. Then there's the systems theory, which basically says everything was too interconnected, so when one pillar fell, the rest followed. Like an ancient Jenga tower made of trade routes and diplomatic letters. And of course, there's the sea peoples. They've been blamed for everything from destroying cities to making historians lose sleep. But they might have just been the symptom, not the cause. Bands of displaced people from collapsing regions, turning to piracy because, well, the economy didn't exactly have job openings. You can almost imagine some poor Mycenaean farmer saying, "Fine, if I can't farm, I'll raid Egypt." A career pivot, Bronze Age style. By around 1100 BCE, the lights had gone out almost everywhere. The great trade network that once linked Egypt to Greece, Cyprus to Babylon, it was gone. Cities shrank, writing systems vanished, palaces fell silent. Populations dropped, possibly by half in some areas. It was, in short, the end of an age, and the start of a very long nap for civilization. But humans are nothing if not stubborn. From the ashes of those old kingdoms, small city-states began to re-emerge. In Greece, scattered villages would, centuries later, give birth to classical civilization. In the Levant, new groups like the Phoenicians started trading again, building ships and sailing west. Egypt hobbled along, older and less shiny, but still breathing. And the Assyrians quietly sharpened their spears, waiting for the next chapter. Still, for a few hundred years, the world had to relearn everything. Writing, governance. It was as if someone hit the reset button on civilization, and the loading screen took 3 centuries. Archaeologists call it the Greek Dark Age, which is accurate, but also kind of dramatic for something that mostly involved people herding goats and forgetting math. When you look at the ruins of Hattusa or Mycenae today with their massive stone blocks and half-crumbled gates, it's hard not to feel that eerie quiet, the sense that something grand once stood there and then simply stopped. No comet, no plague, no single villain. Just a slow, collective unraveling. Maybe that's what makes the Bronze Age collapse so strangely peaceful in retrospect. It wasn't an explosion, it was a long exhale. So tonight, as we drift through these fallen cities, let's remember that even the mightiest empires can go to sleep. And when they wake up, centuries later, they might not even remember their own names. Let's float onward into the dim light of the early Iron Age, where the survivors picked through the ruins and started again, quietly, stubbornly, and with far fewer bronze tools than they'd like. Chapter 2. Picking through the ashes, the survivors of the collapse. When the smoke finally cleared, the world didn't look heroic. It looked tired. The palaces were empty, the scribes unemployed, and the last kings of the Bronze Age were either dead or quietly pretending not to be. But someone had to clean up the mess. And that job fell to the survivors, the farmers, merchants, and wanderers who inherited a world that no longer made sense. If you had wandered through the eastern Mediterranean around 1100 BC, you'd mostly find silence. The great trade ports like Ugarit and Mycenae were abandoned, their harbors choked with sand. Roads once patrolled by chariots were now overgrown with grass. People huddled in small villages on hilltops, far from the empty splendor of the old cities. It wasn't romantic. It was survival. And honestly, no one was in the mood for another empire. Still, a few powers refused to fade quietly. Egypt was one of them. By the time Ramesses III had fended off the Sea Peoples, the empire was more or less on life support. He declared victory, because that's what pharaohs do, but behind the painted reliefs, things were grim. Famine stalked the Nile Valley. Temples struggled to feed their priests. And the once golden bureaucracy of Egypt had become a tangle of corruption and desperation. The workers at Deir el-Medina, those same artisans who had built the grand tombs of kings, were among the first to notice. Their ration deliveries stopped. Their overseers made excuses. Eventually, the artisans did something unheard of in pharaonic Egypt. They walked off the job. The world's first labor strike, recorded neatly on papyrus. They marched to the local temple, politely demanded food, and waited. It took the government a few days to realize that the people carving their gods were now their problem. You'd think that might spark reform, but Egypt had reached that particular stage of history where reform sounds nice but naps sound nicer. After Ramesses III, the line of pharaohs continued, but each one ruled a little less land, commanded a little less respect, and looked a little more like a man managing decline. By around 1000 BC, Egypt was divided between powerful priests in Thebes and weary kings up north. It was less empire and more family business gone wrong. Meanwhile, in the lands of the Hittites, there was, well, not much left to rule. Anatolia, once filled with bustling cities and official seals, had fractured into small, squabbling states. Historians call them the Neo-Hittite kingdoms, which is a generous term for guys who really missed the old days. They spoke a mix of languages, built tiny citadels, and occasionally stamped old Hittite symbols on new documents, as if the paperwork might bring the empire back. It didn't, but you have to respect the optimism. Further south, the Levant began to fill with new people, or perhaps old ones with new names. Out of the wandering chaos came groups like the Philistines, who, according to Egypt, were part of the infamous Sea Peoples. They settled along the coast of Canaan, building cities like Ashdod, Ekron, and Gaza. To their neighbors, they must have seemed strange: foreign pottery styles, unfamiliar gods, and the occasional fondness for pork. But they adapted quickly, and within a generation, they were part of the landscape. Every so often, they'd bump into another small group of tribes just inland, the ones we now call the early Israelites, and politely ruin each other's day for the next few centuries. It's easy to imagine that the Israelites emerged out of nowhere, but archaeology paints a subtler picture. Most were probably locals who retreated into the highlands during the collapse. People who stopped paying tribute to faraway kings because those kings had stopped existing. They built tiny, self-sufficient villages, avoided pork for reasons still debated, and slowly developed a new identity. While empires fell apart elsewhere, they were busy inventing monotheism. Because if everyone else's gods were failing so spectacularly, it made sense to pick just one and hope he worked overtime. To the north, in what's now modern-day Lebanon, the Phoenicians quietly got back to business. While everyone else sulked about the apocalypse, the Phoenicians repaired their ships, restocked their purple dye, and sailed off to find new markets. Cities like Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos became the beating heart of post-collapse trade. They didn't bother with empires, they just traded with whoever was still standing. In a way, they invented the freelancer model of civilization. Need cedar wood? They've got it. Need alphabetic writing? They'll sell you that too. Because yes, the Phoenicians gave us the alphabet. A simplified script that ditched the exhausting pictograms of Egypt and the wedge-stabbing complexity of cuneiform. It was quick, efficient, and perfect for merchants who didn't have time to learn 700 symbols just to write invoice. That alphabet, by the way, would eventually wander west, get adopted by the Greeks, and then the Romans, and then So, while the Bronze Age world collapsed, the Phoenicians were basically setting up humanity's new operating system. Quietly, profitably, without conquering anyone. A nice change of pace. Over in Mesopotamia, the Assyrians were sharpening their styluses and waiting for a comeback. They'd survived the collapse bruised but intact, tucked up in northern Mesopotamia where the trade disruptions weren't quite as bad. For a few generations, they kept things small. Local kings ruling modest territories, surrounded by ruined cities that used to be great. But Assyria had a habit of bouncing back like a bad habit. By 900 BC, they were reorganizing, rebuilding their armies, and writing down long lists of people they'd like to conquer again. The world had gone quiet, and Assyria, of course, couldn't stand silence. Meanwhile, Greece was learning how to be humble. After the burning of the Mycenaean palaces, most of the Greek mainland entered what scholars call the Dark Age, which, to be fair, is just historian speak for, we have no idea what happened. Population dropped, writing disappeared, and people went back to living in small villages, trading only when necessary. Gone were the grand thrones, the linear B-tablets, and the bureaucrats with bad handwriting. Now it was goats, local chieftains, and long evenings of oral storytelling by the fire. Which, in a lovely historical irony, is how the Iliad and the Odyssey eventually survived, passed down through centuries of memorized boredom until someone finally thought, maybe we should write this down again. But that wouldn't happen for centuries. For now, Greece was quiet, rural, and slightly dazed. The gods were still there, of course, Zeus, Hera, all the old crew, but they'd taken on humbler roles. You can almost imagine a Greek shepherd muttering prayers to Apollo before milking his goats, unaware that his descendants would one day build marble temples in that god's name. History's funny like that. Back east, Babylon was fine. Not great, not terrible. The Kassites, who had ruled for centuries, were ousted during the chaos. A new dynasty rose, then fell, then rose again, like an ancient version of a struggling startup that keeps rebranding. They didn't conquer anyone new, but they kept the scribes busy, which is really all Babylon ever wanted. The ziggurats still stood. The gods still received their offerings. The empire had shrunk, but the bureaucracy was eternal. As the centuries crawled by little, the world began to reconnect. Trade crept back along the coasts, Phoenician ships darting between ports, Cypriot merchants cautiously reopening their copper mines. Farmers learned new tricks, iron tools instead of bronze, terraced fields instead of floodplains. Iron wasn't as glamorous as bronze, but it was local, no more depending on foreign tin shipments from halfway across the continent. It was cheaper, tougher, and made it much easier to stab things on a budget. Civilization, as it turned out, was entering the Iron Age. But before it could flourish again, it had to relearn the basics. Writing. Architecture. The generation that survived the collapse had mostly lived through destruction. Their children would be the ones to build again. And you can feel that hesitancy in the archaeology. Smaller houses, simpler pottery, fewer grand monuments. They weren't dreaming big yet. They were making sure they had enough to eat. Over time, though those quiet rebuilders laid the groundwork for everything that came after. The Phoenicians taught the world to write efficiently. The Israelites gave it new ideas about faith and morality. The Assyrians reminded everyone, perhaps a bit too enthusiastically, what centralized power looked like. And the Greeks, eventually, would rediscover art, philosophy, and democracy, mostly after they'd finished perfecting how to argue. Still, if you were alive around 1000 BC, you wouldn't have known any of that. To you, it was just another hard year after too many hard years. The elders might speak of the grand old days, when ships filled the harbors and kings ruled from golden halls. But to the younger generations, that was just myth. The old world had passed into legend. The Bronze Age had become a bedtime story told by people sitting in the ruins of its palaces. And in a strange, poetic way, that's how civilizations heal. They turn their traumas into stories. The Mycenaeans became the heroes of Homer. The Hittites became echoes in Assyrian records. Even Egypt's fading glory turned into tales of divine pharaohs and ancient wisdom. It's easier to sleep when you call your collapse a golden age. So, the survivors did what people always do. They adapted. They farmed, rebuilt, traded, prayed, and taught their children to do better, or at least not worse. The Bronze Age had ended not with one grand event, but with a slow, collective sigh. And the Iron Age began with the sound of hammers on new metal, cautious but steady. The world was smaller now, simpler. But simplicity can be peaceful. Gone were the giant palaces demanding tribute, the endless wars over tin shipments, the bureaucrats counting barley for a god king who barely noticed them. Instead, there were villages, fields, a few stubborn temples, and people, quiet, tired, and ready to start again. Because after everything falls, that's really all there is to do. Chapter 3: The Return of Kings, the Rise of the Iron Empires. By the time the world stumbled into the first centuries of the Iron Age, things were finally, tentatively, getting better. Not good, no one had that kind of optimism yet, but better. The seas were calmer, the harvests were slowly improving, and a new kind of leadership was beginning to crawl out of the ruins. Because, as it turns out, humans can't resist the urge to crown someone and tell them they're special. So, one by one, kingdoms reappeared like weeds after rain. Smaller at first, humbler, almost bashful. But give a ruler a little iron and a surplus of food, and sooner or later, they'll start dreaming of empire again. Let's start in Assyria, because, of course, it's always Assyria. They'd been lurking up north in the city of Ashur, quietly rebuilding. Their scribes kept detailed lists of kings, even when there wasn't much to list. By around 900 BC, a ruler named Ashur-dan II decided it was time to stop moping and start conquering. He reorganized the army, fixed up irrigation, and politely informed neighboring tribes that their land now belonged to Assyria. They disagreed. Briefly. Then came Adad-nirari II, who decided that diplomacy was overrated. He rebuilt fortresses, marched across Mesopotamia, and demanded tribute from anyone within shouting distance. Under his reign and those who followed, Assyria transformed from a regional power into a machine. And when I say machine, I mean a well-oiled bureaucracy of conquest, led by kings who loved nothing more than carving their victories into stone in the largest possible font. By 850 BCE, the Neo-Assyrian Empire had arrived, and it did not do subtlety. Their capital cities, Kalhu, modern Nimrud, Nineveh, and eventually Dur-Sharrukin, were built to impress and intimidate. Massive walls, winged bulls at the gates, long corridors filled with reliefs showing endless parades of defeated enemies. If there was one thing the Assyrians excelled at, besides creative cruelty, it was interior design for the terminally insecure. Their kings, Ashurnasirpal II, Shalmaneser III, Tiglath-Pileser III, read like a greatest hits album of megalomania. Ashurnasirpal II, for instance, once held a grand banquet to celebrate his new palace, inviting 69,574 guests. Which sounds generous, until you realize that most of them were probably required to attend under pain of, well, Assyria. He wrote proudly about hunting lions, conquering cities, and, this is real, washing his weapons in the sea. Because if you're going to invade half the Near East, you might as well clean up afterward. But for all their bluster, the Assyrians weren't just bloodthirsty, they were efficient. They perfected the art of imperial management. Conquered people were relocated to other parts of the empire, breaking up potential rebellions. Local governors reported directly to the king, taxes were standardized, and roads connected everything like Bronze Age Wi-Fi. Trade flourished again: iron, grain, horses, and, of course, slaves. The economy thrived on the spoils of war, which worked great as long as the wars didn't stop. Assyria's neighbors learned two things very quickly. First, that surrendering early saved time. And second, that eventually the Assyrians would overextend themselves. Because they always did. Meanwhile, in the Levant, the Phoenicians were thriving in their own quiet way. While the Assyrians were busy conquering, the Phoenicians were busy selling them things. Cedar wood, glass, textiles, basically everything an empire needed but didn't want to make itself. They expanded westward, founding colonies along the North African coast. One of those colonies, founded by settlers from Tyre around 814 BCE, would later become Carthage. Yes, that Carthage. At the time, though, it was just another coastal outpost, famous mostly for purple dye and extremely patient accountants. In the highlands of Canaan, another people were slowly consolidating power: the Israelites. Their story, filtered through later biblical memory, sounds heroic, but archaeologically it's the same quiet process as everyone else's: villages turning into towns, tribes into monarchies. By around 1000 BC, a man named David ruled a small but ambitious kingdom centered around Jerusalem. His son Solomon followed, building temples, collecting wives, and taxing everyone to fund it. The Bible paints this as a golden age. Archaeologists debate whether it was more of a modest Bronze Lame age. But the symbolism stuck: a small kingdom in a world of empires, trying to hold on to faith and sovereignty amid the noise. When Solomon died, the kingdom promptly split in two: Israel in the north, Judah in the south, because nothing says divinely chosen monarchy like a good old-fashioned civil war. The Assyrians would later take advantage of this, naturally, because that's what Assyrians did best. Further west, Greece was stirring from its centuries-long nap. Around 900 BC, small villages were turning into city-states, or polis: Athens, Sparta, Corinth. The Greeks had started using the Phoenician alphabet, tweaking it to suit their language. For the first time since the Mycenaean collapse, they could write again. And because they were Greek, they immediately used this newfound literacy to compose epic poetry, argue about politics, and insult each other's city-states in verse. Trade returned to the Aegean. Pottery styles became fancy again: geometric patterns, ship scenes, little stick-figure warriors doing questionable battle poses. It was still a simple world, but a creative one. And in that quiet rebuilding, Greece was laying the foundations for the classical age. Though no one living then would have believed it. They were just trying to make decent wine and not get raided by pirates. Meanwhile, back in Egypt, the pharaohs were still technically in charge, but it was getting awkward. The Third Intermediate Period, a polite name for too many kings, not enough country, was in full swing. Different dynasties ruled in Thebes, Tanis, and other cities, sometimes simultaneously, sometimes not talking to each other. The high priests of Ammonius wielded more power than many pharaohs, which must have been humbling for men who still styled themselves as gods. Foreign mercenaries, Libyans, Nubians, and others filled the army. Egypt had become a museum of its own greatness, run by curators who couldn't agree on ticket prices. Around 750 BCE, the south rose again, literally. The kingdom of Kush, based in Nubia, decided it was time to remind Egypt where its gold had come from. The Kushite kings swept north, conquered Thebes, and founded the 25th dynasty, the so-called Black Pharaohs. They rebuilt temples, revived old traditions, and tried to restore the grandeur of the past. It was a noble effort. Unfortunately, they arrived just in time to meet the Assyrians, who were not known for their respect for nostalgia. When the Assyrian armies reached Egypt under Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal, they made quick work of it. Memphis was captured, Thebes was sacked, and Egypt, old, proud Egypt, was once again under foreign rule. The Kushite kings retreated south, leaving behind beautiful statues and a sense that maybe the Bronze Age had been easier. Let's float back to Mesopotamia again. The Assyrians, at their height under Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, and Sennacherib, controlled everything from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. They deported whole populations, built roads, invented postal systems, and generally behaved like history's strictest hall monitors. Their capital cities became wonders of the world, Nineveh especially, with its sprawling libraries and manicured gardens. Sennacherib even claimed to have built a palace without rival, which is exactly what you say before someone burns it down. But that's for later. For now, Assyria was the world's first true superpower, an empire built not just on conquest but on administration, propaganda, and very detailed record-keeping. The scribes wrote everything down: tribute lists, omens, royal boasts, letters from terrified governors. Reading Assyrian records today feels like scrolling through an ancient version of an inbox filled entirely with corporate memos and threats. And yet, despite the cruelty, there's something almost impressive about how it all functioned. The Assyrians had rediscovered the secret the Bronze Age had lost: control through systems. They'd rebuilt the old world's complexity, only now with iron tools, better roads, and more terrifying artwork. It was the Bronze Age 2.0, bloodier, louder, and slightly better organized. To the west, small powers kept orbiting around the Assyrian sun. The Arameans, wandering tribes turned city builders, spread their language across Syria and Mesopotamia. It would eventually become Aramaic, the lingua franca of the Near East for centuries. Even Jesus would later speak a version of it. So, while the Assyrians conquered, the Arameans quietly gave the world a language that outlived them all. In Anatolia, the descendants of the old Hittites, now the Phrygians, had carved out a new kingdom. Their most famous ruler, Midas, allegedly had a golden touch, which, if you think about it, is an excellent metaphor for an economy that goes wrong very quickly. The real Midas likely ruled from Gordon, a city known for its intricate knot that Alexander the Great would later dramatically cut in half. But for now, the Phrygians were content to build strong fortresses, drink their wine, and survive between bigger powers. Across the Aegean, the Greeks were learning to sail farther, trade smarter, and argue longer. By 800 BCE, they were establishing colonies across the Mediterranean, Italy, Sicily, Asia Minor. Not because they wanted empires, but because they wanted space, food, and occasionally better weather. Their ships carried olive oil, pottery, and gossip to every corner of the sea. The Dark Age was over. They'd rediscovered connection. The Iron Age was at last fully awake. Trade networks hummed again, ideas flowed, and kings began commissioning poets instead of just reliefs of impalement. But the old habits lingered. Empires rose, grew greedy, and pushed too far. The Assyrians would soon find out what every overconfident ruler eventually learns: the bigger the palace, the harder the fall. Chapter 4. The Hittites, an empire that forgot how to empire. Let's float over now to Anatolia, or, as it was known back then, that big chunk of land where everyone was trying to control the trade routes. This is where the Hittites lived. And by lived, I mean built one of the most confusing, bureaucratic, and eventually self-destructive empires of the late Bronze Age. The Hittite Empire was basically the middle child of the ancient world. Not as flashy as Egypt, not as intimidating as Babylon, and not as mysterious as the Mycenaeans. But they had ambitions. Big ones. Their capital, Hattusa, sat high up on the Anatolian plateau, surrounded by stone walls that screamed, "Please attack us, we're important." When you look at Hattusa today, it's all crumbling walls and lions carved into gates. But once upon a time, this place was a hub of kings who loved treaties, paranoia, and excessive paperwork. The Hittites had a clay tablet for everything. Trade deals, military rosters, even divine arguments about which god got which temple. If something could be written down, they wrote it down. Which, honestly, was great for historians, and probably exhausting for everyone else. Their kings liked to pretend they were chosen by the gods, but they were more like harried office managers juggling 10 wars and a stack of clay tablets taller than they were. Take Suppiluliuma I, arguably their greatest king. He was smart, ruthless, and had a name that sounded like a sneeze. Under him, the Hittites went from being a regional power to an empire that controlled northern Syria and threatened Egypt itself. They even had that famous little diplomatic episode with Egypt's widowed queen. The story goes that when Tutankhamun died, his widow, desperate and apparently unimpressed by Egypt's bachelor scene, wrote to Suppiluliuma asking if she could marry one of his sons. This was, historically speaking, insane. Egyptians did not marry foreigners, and certainly not the sons of their enemies. But she was tired, alone, and maybe just wanted a change of climate. Suppiluliuma, naturally, was thrilled. Finally, he must have thought, some recognition for the Hittites. He sent his son Zenanza to Egypt to meet his royal bride, and Zenanza was promptly murdered somewhere along the way, probably by Egyptian officials who realized this plan was, in fact, terrible. Suppiluliuma was furious. He launched an invasion out of pure royal spite. Unfortunately, during that campaign, his army picked up a nasty little souvenir, the plague. A real one, not metaphorical. And that plague went back home with them, sweeping through the Hittite heartland like an unwanted houseguest. Suppiluliuma himself caught it and died, and his empire never really recovered from that one bad decision. His sons and grandsons tried to hold it all together, but by the 13th century BCE, the Hittite Empire was looking less like a world power and more like a group project where everyone stopped answering messages. Kings came and went. One of them, Mycenaean III, was overthrown by his uncle, who then spent his reign writing dramatic letters to foreign rulers about how he totally didn't do anything wrong. And then there was the matter of the gods. The Hittites worshipped hundreds of them. Every city had its own set, and they kept adding new ones whenever they conquered someone. Their pantheon became so bloated that even the priests couldn't keep track anymore. They called themselves the land of 1,000 gods, but realistically, it was probably more like the land of 50 slightly confused priests trying to remember whose festival it is this week. Now, to be fair, the Hittites weren't just bumbling bureaucrats. They were innovators. They were among the first to use iron, though not quite enough to start the Iron Age. They wrote laws that, compared to their neighbors, were surprisingly humane. They even allowed for compensation instead of punishment in some cases, which is quite generous for a society that thought disease was caused by divine disappointment. But even with their iron and their tablets and their treaties, the Hittite system was fragile. Too many vassals, too many enemies, too many internal rivalries. And then came the droughts, the famines, the bandits, the mysterious sea peoples who decided to burn their way across the Mediterranean like it was a summer hobby. One by one, the vassal states stopped sending tribute. Grain shipments didn't arrive. Soldiers deserted. Even the royal scribes probably started wondering whether there was any point in documenting a collapse they could literally see happening outside their office windows. By around 1200 BC, Hattusa itself was abandoned. Its massive walls and carved lions left to the wind. The empire simply evaporated. No grand final battle, no heroic last stand, just an administrative silence that spread like fog. When archaeologists later uncovered Hattusa's archives, they found half-finished letters and diplomatic reports that ended mid-sentence. It's as if the entire empire just stopped mid-sentence too. And so, the Hittites joined the long, sad list of Bronze Age civilizations that went from global power to who, in a matter of decades. For a people obsessed with record-keeping, their ending was remarkably undocumented. Still, they left behind one lesson that feels oddly modern. No matter how many treaties you sign, or how many clay tablets you stack, there's always something you can't control, like a plague, a drought, or your neighbor deciding to burn your city for fun. Let's float onward, then, to the shores of Greece. A land of palaces, pottery, and kings who couldn't stop naming themselves after their grandfathers. The Mycenaeans are waiting, and they, too, have no idea what's coming. Chapter 5. The Mycenaeans, Greece before the Greeks. So, let's float gently west now, across the Aegean, to a land of stone palaces, heroic egos, and very questionable interior design choices. This is Mycenaean Greece, the Greece before Greece. The one that came long before the philosophers, the togas, and the marble statues. Back when being civilized mostly meant having good pottery and a functioning trade network. The Mycenaeans were, to put it mildly, ambitious. They built massive fortresses on hilltops, ringed by walls so thick that later Greeks thought they'd been constructed by giants. Cyclopean, they called them, because clearly only one-eyed monsters could lift rocks that heavy. Which, honestly, is a fair assumption when you see the size of those stones. Their cities, Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, were less like charming Greek towns and more like stone bunkers with very specific ideas about security. Everything was built uphill, tightly walled, and a bit claustrophobic. The royal centers weren't exactly cities in the modern sense, more like palatial command hubs surrounded by small settlements. Each one ruled by a wanax, a king who probably considered himself both a warlord and a sil. These wanags were men who loved three things: gold, warfare, and cataloging both. If there was a battle to be had, they'd fight it, or at least write about it in Linear B, their slightly clunky writing system borrowed from the Minoans. Their scribes used it mainly for inventory lists, which is why much of what we know about the Mycenaeans comes from the ancient equivalent of spreadsheets. So many jars of oil, so many slaves, so many tripods. The stuff of legends, truly. But from these dusty tablets and the crumbling remains of their palaces, we can piece together a picture of their world, and it's one that feels surprisingly modern in its dysfunction. The Mycenaeans were networked into the great late Bronze Age economy. They traded with Egypt, the Hittites, and the Near East. They sent ships full of olive oil and perfume, and in return got copper, tin, and shiny luxuries to decorate their already gaudy palaces. They even dabbled in diplomacy, though in the pushiest way possible. One Hittite text complains about Ahiawa, almost certainly referring to the Achaeans, the Mycenaean Greeks, being rude and uncooperative, which, yes, tracks with the later reputation of Greeks in general. Life for the average person was less golden. Most Mycenaeans worked the land or served the palace system. Everything revolved around the central administration, a bureaucratic machine that controlled who grew what, who crafted what, and who paid what in taxes. The palace told you how many sheep you could keep, and if you didn't like it, well, too bad. The wanags had soldiers and walls for a reason. Their religion was a familiar but half-formed version of what would later become Greek mythology. The names were there: Zeus, Poseidon, Hera, but their personalities weren't quite the same yet. Poseidon, interestingly, seems to have been the top god at the time, which makes sense given how much these people depended on ships and trade. Zeus must have been somewhere in the middle management tier of divinity, waiting for his promotion in the next era. As for art, think bold and heavy. Gold death masks with staring eyes, chunky jewelry, frescoes showing stylized bulls and battle scenes. The Mycenaeans didn't do subtle. Their architecture and art screamed power and wealth. Their kings wanted everyone to know they were rich enough to die wrapped in gold foil, and indeed, many did just that. Then there's the question of war. The Mycenaeans seem to have been perpetually armed. Their fortresses, their armor, their weapons. Everything suggests a culture that expected trouble. Maybe from rival kingdoms. Maybe from their own restless subjects. Maybe from nothing at all, but it's always nice to be prepared. Their famous boar's tusk helmets, which Homer later romanticized, were actually made of hundreds of tusks sewn onto leather caps. That's a lot of pigs. And a lot of free time. Now, about that Trojan War, yes, it probably has roots here. The city of Troy, across the sea in Anatolia, was a real place, and the Mycenaeans likely did raid or trade there. Maybe both. Maybe at the same time. But the grand tales of Helen, Achilles, and the wooden horse? Those are later embellishments, centuries after the Mycenaeans themselves had vanished. In their time, it was probably just another messy regional conflict over trade and pride. By the 13th century BCE, though, the cracks were showing. The great palaces started to burn, one after another. Mycenae, Pylos, Thebes, all fell. We don't know exactly why. Maybe invaders. Maybe rebellion. Maybe a drought so severe that the tightly controlled palace economies just stopped functioning. Or maybe it was part of that grand domino effect that was flattening every Bronze Age civilization from Anatolia to Egypt. Whatever it was, the result was the same: collapse. Palaces reduced to ash. Scribes out of work. Trade routes gone silent. The Mycenaean system, which had relied on centralized control and constant imports, couldn't handle the stress. And when the palaces fell, so did literacy. Linear B disappeared. Writing vanished from Greece for centuries. The people didn't die out, they just went quiet. Villages shrank. Kings vanished. Bronze was replaced by iron. And for hundreds of years, the Greeks lived in what historians politely call the Dark Age, which really just means we have no records, so good luck guessing. When literacy returned, so did the myths. The Greeks of later centuries looked back at the ruins and imagined giants and heroes, gods walking among men. They built stories out of rubble, legends out of gaps in memory. Mycenae became the home of Agamemnon. Tiryns, the realm of Heracles. It's a lovely form of historical recycling, really. But if we strip away the later legends, what remains is a society that flew too close to the sun, or at least too close to its own economic limits. The Mycenaeans had built something big, shiny, and unsustainable. And when the world around them crumbled, they didn't adapt. They just stopped. And so Greece entered its long night. The palaces empty, the scribes gone, the heroes turned to myth. But elsewhere, across the sea, other survivors were figuring out how to keep going. Egypt, for instance, clinging on with sheer stubbornness and divine bureaucracy. Let's drift there next, to the land of the Nile, where the pharaohs were watching the same world burn, and trying very hard to pretend it wasn't their problem. Chapter 6, Egypt at the Edge. Pharaohs in denial, literally. Let's float gently south now to the banks of the Nile, where the pharaohs were still very much in charge, or at least, still very much pretending they were. By the time the Bronze Age was collapsing, Egypt was entering what historians call the Third Intermediate Period, which is basically a polite way of saying, everybody's confused, the kings are weak, and someone's probably running the place behind the throne. After the death of Ramesses III, Egypt's glory days had faded like old paint. The royal line splintered, and power was increasingly in the hands of high priests, particularly those devoted to Ammonius at Thebes. The pharaohs north of Thebes could claim the throne, but the priests in the south had the real influence: the money, the armies, the food. If you think of it like a modern company, the pharaohs were figurehead CEOs while the CFO and HR director ran the show. Some pharaohs were perfectly aware of this and did what kings have always done in such situations: pretend everything was fine. They continued building temples and commissioning statues, because nothing says, "I'm in control," like more stonework when the granaries are empty. Meanwhile, mercenaries filled the ranks of the army: Libyans, Nubians, even Canaanites. They fought, they collected pay, and some probably muttered under their breath about how nice it was not being in the desert for free. The high priests, of course, weren't content with subtlety. They had their own armies, controlled the wealth of the temples, and managed grain distribution. When famine struck, and it often did during this period, the priests became indispensable. The people needed food. The priests had it. The pharaoh? Well, he had ceremonial power and a collection of gold statues. There was one particularly awkward dynasty around this time, the 22nd and 23rd dynasties. They ruled concurrently in different regions. Sometimes they acknowledged each other. Sometimes they didn't. Battles and border skirmishes broke out, but mostly it was a low-key struggle of bureaucracy. A pharaoh might appoint a governor in one city, only to have the local priest shrug and say, "Yeah, good luck with that." Then there was the Libyan influence. Libyan mercenary families began settling in the delta, marrying into Egyptian nobility, and eventually rising to power themselves. By the late Third Intermediate Period, Egypt had essentially outsourced kingship to a few Libyan dynasties, still dressed as pharaohs, still adorning temples with hieroglyphs, but not exactly ruling the old way. It was like a historical power move disguised as cosplay. Meanwhile, the Nile itself became temperamental. Crop failures were increasingly common, likely due to climate shifts and overuse of land. Floods were inconsistent. Starvation and famine became recurring issues. But the pharaohs and priests stuck to the familiar ritual, offer sacrifices, chant prayers, and build more temples. Because why confront reality when you can carve statues that say everything's fine? On top of that, foreign powers were circling. Assyria was growing stronger, the Nubians were consolidating to the south, and the remnants of Levantine trade networks were trying to reconnect. Egypt could no longer dominate the eastern Mediterranean. Their fleets were smaller, their armies patchwork, and their influence mostly symbolic. Yet, somehow, the bureaucracy continued. Scribes recorded minor victories and temple donations, keeping the illusion of an orderly kingdom. This period also saw the famous Nubian resurgence. The kingdom of Kush, based at Napata and later Meroe, began asserting itself. Kushite kings, sometimes called Black Pharaohs, swept north into Egypt and took over Thebes, attempting to revive old traditions. They built temples, restored monuments, and styled themselves as divine rulers, trying to make Egypt feel like it had returned to its former glory. But even the Kushites had limits. When Assyria finally decided to flex, they pushed the Nubians back south. Egypt was again under foreign pressure, its old pharaohs more ceremonial than practical. Yet the temples remained, the statues remained, and the rituals went on. The people farmed, the priests collected tithes, and the pharaohs maintained appearances. Egypt endured, quietly, stubbornly, like a cat ignoring a flood while keeping its paws clean. What's striking about this period is the resilience of the system. Unlike the Mycenaeans, who fell silent for centuries, or the Hittites, who simply disappeared, Egypt adapted. It contracted, fragmented, and outsourced power, but it never quite stopped functioning. The Nile provided life, the bureaucracy provided continuity, and the pharaohs, ceremonial or otherwise, gave people something to focus on while the outside world was chaotic. The third intermediate period is a masterclass in slow decline and quiet survival. Kings came and went, priests wielded power, mercenaries filled armies, and climate tested everyone's patience. Yet the rituals, the temples, and the bureaucratic records endured. For the average Egyptian, daily life was a mix of work, worship, and keeping one eye on the river. Crops were planted, taxes collected, and occasional rebellions were put down by hired soldiers. It was not glamorous. It was not epic. It was, in fact, extraordinarily ordinary. And yet that ordinariness is why Egypt survived when so much of the Bronze Age world fell apart. By the time the Assyrians arrived in the late 8th and 7th centuries BCE, they found an Egypt that looked impressive on the surface. Temples stood, statues gleamed, and pharaohs sat on thrones, all the familiar symbols of order. But scratch the surface, and you'd find a kingdom that had learned to survive by pretending everything was fine. Survival, in Egypt's case, was a long, slow game of denial. The pharaohs kept their rituals, the priests kept their power, and the people adapted to scarcity. When neighboring civilizations collapsed, Egypt endured, not through military might alone, but through the remarkable ability to maintain systems, symbols, and stories even when reality was inconvenient. So, while the Mycenaeans and Hittites vanished into legend and ash, Egypt persisted. And those centuries of quiet persistence would lay the groundwork for later resurgences, the 26th dynasty, the Sate Renaissance, and beyond. The lesson here is subtle. Endurance often comes not from conquest or glory, but from adaptation, continuity, and a healthy dose of willful ignorance. And as we leave the Nile and drift back north, we'll see how other powers, less patient and more aggressive, began to take advantage of the post-Bronze Age world. Civilizations that rose not quietly like Egypt, but with iron, ambition, and often a taste for blood. Chapter 7. The Assyrians ascend, empire by iron and intimidation. Now let's drift back north to Mesopotamia, where the Assyrians were quietly plotting to remind the world who really remembered how to run an empire. Unlike the cautious Egyptians, who mastered survival through patience and bureaucracy, the Assyrians had a slightly different philosophy. If in doubt, build bigger walls, sharpen your swords, and terrify everyone within sight. By around 900 BCE, Assyria had emerged from the shadows of the Bronze Age collapse. Their heartland, along the Tigris in what is now northern Iraq, was relatively secure. Unlike their neighbors, they hadn't been utterly destroyed by the waves of famine, plague, and invasions that toppled so many Bronze Age civilizations. Instead, they spent the intervening decades reorganizing. They rebuilt cities like Ashur, Nineveh, and Kalhu, repaired irrigation, and restructured the military. The bureaucracy came back online, and suddenly the Assyrians were not just a minor kingdom, they were a well-oiled war machine, and everyone else should probably start worrying. The first king to really make a name in this resurgence was Narrated II. He consolidated power, subdued rebellious city-states, and began campaigns to the west. Under him, Assyria transformed from a regional power into something more ambitious, a kingdom with designs on empire. And this is where the Assyrians' signature mix of efficiency and intimidation started to shine. They were meticulous record keepers, not only of their victories but of every tribute, every conquered city, and every possible reason someone might revolt. Everything had a paper trail. Following Narrated II, Tiglath-Pileser III arrived in the mid-8th century BCE and decided subtleness was overrated. He reformed the army, introducing professional soldiers, siege engines, and a cavalry corps that was way ahead of its time. Vassal states were relocated and resettled, which is historian speak for, "We'll move you far away from your friends and make sure you like us less." Local governors answered directly to the king, and taxes were standardized across the empire. If you didn't pay, you had the misfortune of experiencing Assyrian enforcement firsthand. And that enforcement was memorable. Assyrian kings loved to decorate palaces with reliefs showing exactly what happened to people who dared disobey. Scenes of captives being impaled, flayed, or otherwise subdued were common. They weren't subtle about intimidation. You could say the Assyrians understood psychological warfare long before the term existed. If you could see what happened to your neighbor, you'd probably pay your taxes. Or run. Or both. By the time Sargon II took the throne in the late 8th century BCE, Assyria was a sprawling empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. Cities like Dur-Sharrukin, a completely new capital he built from scratch, became monuments to imperial ambition. Sargon's successors, including Sennacherib, expanded the empire further, incorporating Babylon, parts of Anatolia, and much of the Levant. The Assyrian network of roads, fortified cities, and garrisons allowed them to move troops quickly, a force multiplier in a world that had just spent a century recovering from chaos. And yet, for all their military prowess, the Assyrians weren't just warmongers. They were administrators. Scribes documented every shipment of grain, every brick in every fortress, and every tribute sent to Nineveh. It was an empire run on spreadsheets, or clay tablets, which is basically the same thing. The balance between bureaucracy and brutality is what made Assyria both fearsome and effective. Still, the Assyrians had a flair for the dramatic. Sennacherib's siege of Lachish in Judah is legendary. Reliefs from his palace in Nineveh show the city being stormed, its leaders deported, and civilians brutally punished. It's detailed enough to make you squirm, but it also sends a message: resistance is costly. The Assyrians used terror as a policy, and it worked, most of the time. Their power didn't come from luck. They combined iron weapons, disciplined armies, professional bureaucracy, and psychological intimidation. Their generals knew how to build fortifications, how to manage logistics, and how to punish rebellion effectively. They inherited the administrative lessons of the Bronze Age but added sharper swords, stronger armor, and zero tolerance for inefficiency. Meanwhile, their neighbors were less organized. Egypt was still patching together dynasties, the Kushites were watching nervously from the south, and the Levant was a patchwork of small kingdoms. Assyria filled that power vacuum with ruthless precision. Trade routes reopened under Assyrian control, but it was clear: defiance was dangerous. Even distant lands like Phoenicia had to negotiate, pay tribute, or face the consequences. Yet, despite all the glory, the Assyrian system was brittle in its own way. Dependence on centralized administration meant that if the bureaucracy faltered, rebellions spread quickly. Overextension made supply lines vulnerable. And yes, they were hated. Everywhere. People wanted Assyria gone. Sometimes politely, sometimes violently. The empire's success, in a sense, sowed the seeds of its eventual downfall. Still, for the moment, the Assyrians were unstoppable. Their combination of iron, discipline, and strategic terror made them the most formidable empire since the Bronze Age's greatest powers. They had survived chaos, rebuilt stronger, and demonstrated a terrifying lesson. The world after collapse belonged to those who could combine efficiency with intimidation. From the perspective of a contemporary observer, if you were alive in the 8th century BCE and had eyes to see, Assyria would have looked like destiny in human form. Kings, cities, and kingdoms either submitted or vanished. Roads connected the empire like veins. Armies moved with frightening speed. And the Assyrian scribes documented it all, leaving a record that echoes even today. Yet, for all the might, Assyria was human. Kings died, generals rebelled, and overconfidence spread like a disease. Their triumphs were impressive, terrifying, and, in the grand arc of history, temporary. But at this moment, 750 to 700 BC, they were the undisputed masters of the post-Bronze Age world. Chapter 8. The Levant, Trade, Tribes, and Tiny Kingdoms Between Giants. Now let's drift westward along the eastern Mediterranean, to the Levant, that narrow strip of land squeezed between the mountains and the sea, where everyone who was anyone in the Near East wanted a peace, and everyone else was mostly just trying to survive. This was a land of tiny kingdoms, ambitious city-states, wandering tribes, and a population that, frankly, learned early how to adapt or get eaten by someone bigger. By the early Iron Age, the Levant was a patchwork quilt of powers, none of them especially large, but all stubbornly independent. Phoenicia dominated the coastline, famous for their maritime skills, luxury goods, and the invention of the alphabet that would later inspire the Greeks. If you needed cedar, glass, or the ability to send an angry letter without it getting lost in translation, Phoenicians were your people. They didn't conquer much, but they traded endlessly, and traded smartly. Inland, smaller kingdoms like Israel, Judah, Ammon, Moab, and Edom tried to carve out stability amid chaos. They were often at each other's throats, partly out of historical rivalry, partly because everyone was stressed about food shortages and the occasional Assyrian invasion. Life in the Levant was never quiet. It was a delicate balancing act between diplomacy, bribery, and occasionally sending the army out to make a point. The Israelites, for example, were consolidating their kingdoms during this period. After Solomon's death, Israel split into northern and southern halves, Israel in the north, Judah in the south. This political fragmentation left them vulnerable. Assyria noticed this early on. Israel paid tribute when forced, rebelled when convenient, and ultimately fell to Assyria in the 8th century BC. Judah survived longer, mostly by being smaller, more cautious, and occasionally very persuasive in diplomacy. Ammon, Moab, and Edom, often overlooked by history, survived through a combination of tribal cohesion, paying tribute, and knowing when to duck. They were the specialists of subtle survival. They didn't have massive armies or monuments to boast about. Their kingdoms were compact, their leaders cautious, and their economies practical, which, in a region squeezed between Egypt and Assyria, was a very smart strategy. And then there were the Philistines who had settled along the southern coast. They were descendants of sea peoples, with a culture partly Aegean and partly local, and they loved iron. They were expert blacksmiths and warlike enough to make Israelite and Egyptian kings nervous. They fortified cities like Ashdod, Gaza, and Ekron, which were strategically placed along the coast. Their economy combined agriculture, trade, and raiding. Basically, they did a little bit of everything and survived on flexibility. Trade in the Levant was remarkably sophisticated for its size. Caravans moved inland carrying copper from Cyprus, silver from Anatolia, and food from the Nile Delta. Ports like Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos exported cedar, glass, and purple dye, the luxury commodities of the age. Phoenician merchants even established colonies across the Mediterranean, including Carthage, which would later become a major player. For the tiny kingdoms and city-states, Being a trade hub could be more valuable than holding territory. Religion and politics were deeply intertwined. Temples weren't just for worship, they were administrative centers, storage facilities, and banking hubs. Kings often ruled with the endorsement of local deities, and priests acted as power brokers. A temple could sustain a city-state through famine, record transactions, and even influence diplomacy. So if your god liked you, your kingdom might survive a drought or an invasion. If not, well, history tends to skip over the details politely. Life in the Levant, therefore, was defined by pragmatism. Leaders built alliances, paid tribute, and occasionally rebelled. Cities invested in walls and fortresses because bandits, rival kingdoms, and occasionally larger empires, looking at you, Assyria, could appear at any moment. The terrain, a combination of mountains, valleys, and coastline, naturally lent itself to small, defensible pockets of civilization. Geography, combined with careful diplomacy, was survival's best friend. Culturally, this period saw a blending of influences. Egyptian motifs survived in art, Mesopotamian administrative practices were adapted locally, and Aegean ideas trickled down from Phoenician traders. Language, too, was evolving. Aramaic spread as a lingua franca, while Hebrew and other local languages persisted in small, tightly knit communities. Written communication became a tool of both administration and propaganda, a subtle reminder that even tiny kingdoms could project influence if they played the game wisely. For the average inhabitant, daily life oscillated between the mundane and the strategic. Farmers planted crops, shepherds moved their flocks, and artisans produced goods for local markets or for export. Occasionally, they would witness armies marching through their lands or hear rumors of Assyrian campaigns up north. Survival required a mix of caution, adaptability, and a keen awareness of who was paying tribute to whom. In some ways, the Levant during this period was the opposite of Assyria. Where Assyria relied on terror, bureaucracy, and military discipline to maintain control, the Levant relied on nimbleness, local alliances, and diplomacy. Where Assyrian cities grew large, wealthy, and intimidating, Levantine city-states remained relatively small, resilient, and adaptable. Both strategies worked in their own contexts, one for building empire, the other for surviving between empires. By the 7th century BCE, this balance of power was delicate. Assyria loomed large, Egypt lingered in decline, and the Levant's small kingdoms tried not to be crushed in the middle. Trade routes hummed with activity, towns fortified their walls, and local rulers juggled loyalty, tribute, and survival. It was a region perpetually at the edge, politically, economically, and physically, and that edge defined life for centuries to come. In this way, the Levant became a kind of buffer zone, a crossroads where the ambitions of empires and the pragmatism of small kingdoms collided. Its people learned quickly. Adaptability was more valuable than glory, and survival often depended on clever alliances rather than brute force. As the Iron Age continued to mature, the Levant would remain central in the unfolding drama of empires. Assyrian power would wax and wane, Babylonian ambitions would rise, and eventually, the Persian Empire would sweep through, incorporating the region into a larger imperial framework. But during these early post-Bronze Age centuries, the Levant's mosaic of tiny kingdoms was a testament to resilience, flexibility, and the subtle art of surviving between giants. Next, we'll drift north into Anatolia and Mesopotamia again, where kingdoms like Phrygia and Urartu were quietly consolidating power, small, determined, and ready to take advantage of a world still waking from the Bronze Age collapse. Chapter 9: Urartu and Phrygia, the mountain kingdoms of the early Iron Age. Now let's drift gently northeast into the rugged highlands of eastern Anatolia and the Armenian Plateau, where two lesser-known but fascinating powers were quietly consolidating themselves: Urartu and Phrygia. These were kingdoms built on mountains, fortresses, and a healthy respect for practical survival, the kind of places that might seem remote but were strategically vital in a world still recovering from the Bronze Age collapse. Let's start with Urartu, located roughly around modern eastern Turkey, Armenia, and northwestern Iran. Its people, sometimes called the Kingdom of the Rivers, thrived in highlands, valleys, and craggy fortresses. The Urartians had a knack for fortification. Their citadels were often perched on rocky hills, commanding views of the valleys below. It was impossible to attack without being seen, which gave them a kind of natural insurance against larger, more aggressive neighbors. Geography was their first line of defense, and they exploited it ruthlessly. Urartian kings ruled with a combination of military discipline and administrative order. They kept detailed records, mostly on inscriptions carved into stone rather than clay tablets. They built canals and irrigation systems to support agriculture, ensuring that their cities could survive both siege and famine. The Urartians were iron users, like many of their contemporaries, and they leveraged this to maintain a technological edge in weapons and tools. Iron plows, iron-tipped spears, and iron armor gave their relatively small population the means to punch above its weight. Trade was more modest in Urartu than in the Levant or Phoenicia, but it existed. They exported metals and controlled key mountain passes, which meant they could levy tolls and regulate movement between Mesopotamia and the northern regions. For a highland kingdom, that was a considerable advantage. It wasn't flashy, but it worked. Their neighbors, Assyria to the south, Phrygia to the west, could not ignore Ur. Assyrian records describe campaigns against Urartian kings, showing a mix of respect and irritation. Urartu fought back when it could, retreated when necessary, and maintained a surprisingly stable system for centuries. Their fortresses, some of which survive in part today, are a testament to their resilience and architectural skill. Now let's drift westward, into Phrygia, in central Anatolia. The Phrygians were culturally distinct from the Urartians, more influenced by the remnants of Hittite civilization and, to some extent, Mycenaean and Aegean traditions. Their kings, most famously Midas, became immortalized in legend for having a golden touch, though historians suspect that story may have been more metaphorical than literal. Phrygia's landscape was less rugged than Urartu but still defensible. Its capital, Gordion, was strategically located near key trade routes. Phrygian kings understood that controlling trade was as important as building walls or armies. They could tax merchants, levy tolls, and extract resources from passing caravans, giving them both wealth and influence. Culturally, Phrygia blended old Hittite traditions with local innovations. Their art and architecture were bold but practical, emphasizing fortified structures, palaces, and monumental tombs. The Phrygian alphabet evolved from Hittite and Phoenician scripts, marking them as participants in the broader literacy revival of the early Iron Age. Phrygia, like Urartu, was an intermediary power. They weren't empires like Assyria, but they were significant players. Their interactions with Assyria included tribute payments, occasional resistance, and a fair amount of diplomatic theater. The Phrygians understood that survival in a region dominated by a superpower required both cunning and patience. Interestingly, both Urartu and Phrygia illustrate a pattern of post-Bronze Age survival: geography, fortification, and controlled administration. Unlike the Mycenaeans or Hittites, whose palaces fell quickly, these mountain kingdoms leveraged natural defenses and bureaucratic organization to endure. They weren't trying to dominate the world. They were trying to survive, and sometimes that's just as impressive. Life for ordinary Urartians and Phrygians was a mix of farming, metallurgy, and local craft production. Villagers produced grain, sheep, and iron tools. Artisans created pottery, jewelry, and metalwork, and soldiers defended the highlands from invaders and raiders. Kings managed tribute, organized military campaigns, and maintained fortresses, a delicate balance of coercion and administration. Religion also played a role. Urartians worshipped a pantheon of gods, often linked to natural forces like the sun, storms, and mountains. Phrygians had their own distinctive religious practices, emphasizing fertility and chthonic deities. Temples and shrines functioned not only as centers of worship but also as administrative and storage facilities, reinforcing the integration of religion and governance. By the 8th century BCE, these kingdoms had stabilized. Assyria loomed as a formidable power, but Urartu and Phrygia were far from helpless. They negotiated, paid tribute when necessary, and maintained local control. Their highlands and fortresses provided both protection and autonomy. and because of their careful balance of resources, administration, and defense, they became enduring features in a world still recovering from collapse. The lesson from these mountain kingdoms is subtle but important. Survival after the Bronze Age collapse required adaptability, clever use of geography, and an understanding of one's relative power. Unlike empires that sought to dominate, Urartu and Phrygia thrived by knowing their limits and exploiting them. As we leave the highlands, we can drift back to Mesopotamia and the Levant, where Assyria is reaching the peak of its power, and other kingdoms are learning that survival requires both courage and cunning. Chapter 10. Babylon and the Neo-Assyrian Rivalries, Empire Tested. Let's drift back down into Mesopotamia, to the land between the rivers, where the great city of Babylon loomed like an old but stubborn neighbor, always reminding everyone that it had been here first. By the early Iron Age, Babylon had been rebuilt after the collapse of the Bronze Age, and while it was no longer the dominant force it had been under Hammurabi, it remained culturally, economically, and politically significant. Babylon was a city that understood subtlety. Unlike Assyria, which preferred sharp iron and intimidation, Babylon relied on history, tradition, and an almost obsessive attachment to law, learning, and ritual. The Babylonians were meticulous scholars, astronomers, and administrators. They recorded omens, star positions, and agricultural cycles, partly because they genuinely cared about predicting the future, and partly because it helped them argue with their neighbors over water rights. By the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, Babylon found itself increasingly under pressure from its aggressive northern neighbor, Assyria. The Assyrians demanded tribute, launched military campaigns, and installed puppet rulers whenever Babylon's kings became too independent. Yet Babylon was never entirely submissive. Kings like Marduk-Shumi I and Nabomukenziri resisted when they could, staged rebellions, and leveraged diplomacy with Elam, Urartu, and other regional powers to maintain some degree of autonomy. It was a delicate game of political chess, where a misstep could mean the sack of your city. The rivalry between Babylon and Assyria was a story of contrasts. Assyria expanded through sheer military efficiency, terror, and administrative rigor. Babylon relied on prestige, culture, and alliances. When Assyria tried to crush Babylon outright, it often found itself embroiled in prolonged campaigns, because Babylonians were stubborn, heavily fortified, and culturally proud. Siege warfare in Mesopotamia wasn't about quick battles. It was a drawn-out affair involving canals, dikes, and long-term provisioning, and the Babylonians were masters at it. One of the most famous confrontations was under Sennacherib, the Assyrian king who campaigned against Babylon in the early 7th century BC. Sennacherib captured and destroyed the city, deported many of its inhabitants, and boasted about it in his inscriptions. Yet this act of brutality did not permanently solve the Babylon problem. The city rose again, rebuilt its walls, and continued to resist Assyrian domination. Babylonians had the remarkable ability to endure cycles of destruction and restoration, partly because of their sophisticated bureaucracy and partly because the Tigris and Euphrates made the land incredibly fertile. Starvation wasn't permanent if you could control irrigation. Babylonian kings often had to negotiate multiple threats at once. There were internal factions, competing priesthoods, vassal cities, and neighboring kingdoms all looking for opportunities. Leadership was less about conquest than about survival, diplomacy, and maintaining legitimacy in the eyes of both gods and people. Royal propaganda stressed divine favor and historical continuity. We are the rightful rulers because our ancestors were kings, and the gods still approve. In a world of constantly shifting empires, that claim mattered. The rivalry also had cultural consequences. Assyrian kings borrowed Babylonian gods and rituals, realizing that controlling Mesopotamia required some degree of cultural assimilation. Babylonian scholars influenced Assyrian administration, astronomy, and literature. Even the Assyrians, terrifying as they were, recognized the enduring value of Babylonian sophistication. It's almost quaint. The military juggernaut needed the quiet city of scribes to legitimize its conquests. For ordinary Babylonians, life in this period was a mixture of prosperity, anxiety, and resilience. Farmers cultivated rich alluvial soil, Traders moved goods along river routes, and artisans produced the famed Babylonian brickwork, pottery, and cylinder seals. Every so often, armies would march through, taxes would be collected, and city gates would be repaired. It was an environment where long-term thinking paid off, because while Assyria might conquer temporarily, Babylon's society could rebound over generations. By the 7th century BCE, the Neo-Assyrian Empire had reached its zenith, but Babylon's cultural and historical weight made it a thorn in their side. Assyria ruled militarily, but Babylon persisted as a spiritual, intellectual, and symbolic center. The rivalry illustrates a fundamental principle of the post-Bronze Age world. Brute force could dominate, but sustainable cultural, administrative, and geographic advantages allowed cities to endure even under repeated assault. And so, while Assyria marched to expand its empire through conquest and terror, Babylon demonstrated a different kind of power: endurance, tradition, and the subtle leverage of history itself. The two states, though bitter rivals, were entwined in a dance that would shape Mesopotamia for centuries to come. As we drift away from Babylon and look to the Western Mediterranean, we can see another pattern emerging: smaller, resilient societies learning to thrive under the shadow of giants, using trade, diplomacy, and adaptability rather than sheer force. It's a theme that repeats itself over and over in the centuries after the Bronze Age collapse. Chapter 11. The Phoenicians, Masters of the Sea and Survival. Let's drift back west along the eastern Mediterranean coast to the narrow strip of land we call the Levant, home to the Phoenicians. Unlike the larger, landlocked empires that relied on armies and intimidation, the Phoenicians' survival strategy was simple: boats, trade, and subtle cunning. They were masters of the sea, and that alone allowed them to carve out a remarkable niche in a post-Bronze Age world still figuring out how to recover. The Phoenician cities, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and later Carthage across the sea, weren't enormous in population, but they were wealthy and influential far beyond their size. Their power didn't come from conquest or monumental armies. It came from trade, craftsmanship, and an understanding that the Mediterranean was not a barrier, but a highway. Cedar wood, purple dye, fine textiles, glass, and luxury goods moved constantly through Phoenician ports. They also developed a reputation for maritime innovation: sturdy ships, advanced navigation, and the ability to cross long distances safely, which was not trivial in a world where storms and pirates were common. Phoenician society was heavily urbanized for the period. Cities were walled and fortified, but walls were almost secondary to the fleet. Tyre, for instance, was an island city connected to the mainland by a narrow causeway. Invaders could starve the city, but controlling the sea was a different story. As long as the Phoenician ships remained active, the city remained supplied, connected, and influential. The Phoenicians' greatest contribution to history may have been their alphabet. By simplifying earlier cuneiform and hieroglyphic systems into a manageable script of 22 consonantal letters, they created a writing system that could be learned, taught, and used widely. This alphabet would be adapted by the Greeks and eventually spread throughout the Mediterranean. For a civilization surviving between empires, the alphabet was both practical and subtly subversive. It allowed record-keeping, trade contracts, and communication that didn't require monumental bureaucracy. Efficiency and survival, packaged in 22 letters. Politics in Phoenicia was decentralized. Each city was essentially a city-state, ruled by its own king or council. They cooperated when convenient and competed when necessary. Tribute was paid selectively, usually to Assyria, sometimes to Egypt, and occasionally to more distant powers. The Phoenicians were pragmatic, thriving not through military might, but by reading the balance of power and aligning themselves accordingly. In other words, they survived by being clever and commercially minded, not by intimidating neighbors with armies or building massive palaces. Religion and culture flourished alongside trade. Temples to gods like Baal, Astarte, and Melkart were also economic centers, managing storage, trade records, and civic administration. The intertwining of commerce and religion gave Phoenician cities resilience. Even if political circumstances shifted, economic and religious networks endured. Life for ordinary Phoenicians revolved around maritime trade, artisanal production, and agriculture in limited coastal and inland spaces. Craftsmen specialized in glassmaking, purple dye, and fine woodwork. Merchants traveled widely, carrying goods, news, and sometimes ideas. Unlike the peasants trapped under heavy tribute in large empires, Phoenician society offered opportunities for mobility and innovation. By the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, the Phoenicians had mastered survival in a post-Bronze Age Mediterranean dominated by larger, more aggressive neighbors. Assyria, Egypt, and later Babylon loomed nearby, but the Phoenicians' fleets, trade networks, and diplomatic agility allowed them to thrive. They didn't conquer empires. They didn't crush cities. They endured. And in a world that had just seen the collapse of so many powers, enduring was exactly the skill that mattered most. Their colonies, especially Carthage, would eventually project Phoenician influence far beyond the Levant, setting the stage for centuries of Mediterranean trade and cultural exchange. But at this early stage, it was a quiet mastery of survival, fleets, commerce, and the occasional clever tribute payment that allowed them to persist while others fell or were absorbed by larger empires. In many ways, the Phoenicians exemplify a post-Bronze Age lesson. Survival often comes not through brute force or monumental glory, but through adaptability, connectivity, and the skillful reading of changing power dynamics. While other civilizations were trying to rebuild palaces or armies, the Phoenicians were mastering the sea and the ledger, quietly ensuring that they and their culture would endure. From here, we can drift further east and explore Elam and the Zagros Highlands, where smaller, resilient kingdoms were quietly negotiating survival in the shadow of greater powers. Their story is less flashy, but equally important for understanding the post-collapse world. Chapter 12. Elam and the Zagros Highlands, resilient kingdoms in the shadow of giants. Now let's drift east, into the rugged highlands of what is now southwestern Iran, the land of Elam and the Zagros Mountains. This region was never easy to control. The terrain was steep, rocky, and dotted with isolated valleys, perfect for stubborn local rulers who had learned over centuries that survival often meant being inconvenient to conquer. Elam had a long history, predating the Bronze Age collapse, and by the early Iron Age, it was quietly consolidating power. Unlike Assyria, which relied on terror and administrative efficiency, or Babylon, which relied on cultural prestige, Elam's strength lay in terrain and adaptability. The Zagros Mountains acted as natural fortresses, making large-scale invasions difficult. Any army moving through the highlands had to contend with narrow passes, hidden valleys, and locals who knew the land intimately. Geography was their ally, and the Elamites used it well. The capital, Susa, was both a political and cultural center. It controlled trade routes connecting Mesopotamia to the Iranian plateau, Anatolia, and beyond. Elamites were skilled administrators and traders, keeping records of tribute, trade, and landholdings on clay tablets. Their writing system was adapted from earlier cuneiform traditions, allowing them to maintain bureaucratic continuity even as neighboring empires rose and fell. Military power was important, but Elam's approach was cautious and defensive. Fortresses perched on hills, garrisons controlling key mountain passes, and alliances with neighboring highland tribes all combined to create a network of resilient control. Direct confrontation with a power like Assyria was risky, so Elamite kings often opted for diplomacy, tribute, or opportunistic raids rather than head-on war. Flexibility was key. The Zagros Highlands themselves were home to smaller tribal polities, each with its own local leaders. These groups could be integrated into the Elamite administrative system through marriage alliances, tribute arrangements, and shared religious practices. The terrain made central control difficult, but also made rebellion less catastrophic. Local uprisings could be isolated, contained, and eventually reintegrated. Economically, the highlands were modest but reliable. Agriculture in the valleys supported local populations, while trade along mountain passes brought in copper, tin, and luxury goods. Artisans produced pottery, textiles, and metalwork, often influenced by both Mesopotamian and local traditions. Elamites had a taste for ornate decoration, especially in jewelry and ceremonial objects, reflecting both wealth and cultural sophistication. Religion was closely intertwined with governance. Elamite kings often claimed divine favor and patronized temples to local gods. Temples served as administrative centers, storage facilities, and symbols of legitimacy. Rituals reinforced social cohesion and helped integrate various highland tribes into a coherent polity. Unlike larger empires that relied on terror, Elam's power relied on belief, obligation, and careful negotiation. Despite their resilience, the Elamites were never fully insulated from their aggressive neighbors. Assyria launched campaigns into the Zagros when convenient, often extracting tribute or punishing rebellions. Yet the highlands made permanent conquest difficult. Elamites could retreat, regroup, and resurface when the Assyrians overextended themselves. This cyclical pattern of invasion, survival, and recovery became a defining feature of Elamite history during the early Iron Age. The Elamites also maintained cultural influence far beyond their political power. Their art, architecture, and administrative practices influenced neighboring regions, and their scribes preserved knowledge that would later inform Mesopotamian and Persian traditions. They were survivors in a chaotic landscape, quietly asserting their presence without ever achieving the scale of an Assyrian empire. Life for ordinary people in the Zagros highlands combined agriculture, herding, and craftwork. Communities were often small and self-reliant, accustomed to difficult terrain and occasional conflict. While the kings managed diplomacy and fortifications, villagers focused on sustaining their families, producing goods, and navigating the subtle politics of mountain life. By the end of the early Iron Age, Elam and the Zagros highlands had demonstrated a remarkable principle. Geography, local alliances, and adaptability could allow a civilization to endure even in the shadow of larger, more aggressive powers. They were neither conquerors nor spectacularly wealthy, but they survived, maintaining culture, administration, and independence in a world still reeling from the collapse of the Bronze Age. From here, we can drift north and west again, toward the emerging powers of Anatolia and Greece, and see how smaller, resilient societies continued to navigate a post-collapse world dominated by ambitious empires like Assyria. Chapter 13. Lydia and Early Anatolian Kingdoms, Wealth, Coin, and Cunning. Let's drift westward into the fertile lands of western Anatolia, where the kingdom of Lydia and its neighbors quietly carved out prosperity in the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse. Unlike empires that relied on sheer military might, Lydia thrived on commerce, innovation, and strategic cunning, a survival strategy perfectly suited for a region squeezed between the aggressive Assyrians to the east and the restless Greek city-states to the west. Lydia's most famous kings, particularly Gyges and later Croesus, became legendary for wealth. This wasn't just legend or exaggeration. The kingdom had access to rich alluvial deposits of gold and silver along the Pactolus River, which allowed them to mint some of the world's first coins. Coinage was a game changer. Suddenly, economic transactions didn't have to rely on barter or cumbersome ingots. Trade became more fluid, taxation more standardized, and rulers could project power through wealth instead of solely through armies. In a post-Bronze Age world, this economic sophistication mattered enormously. But Lydia wasn't just about money. It was also strategically positioned. The kingdom controlled fertile plains, important river valleys, and access to trade routes leading to the Aegean. Its neighbors included Phrygia to the east, Greek city-states along the coast, and various smaller Anatolian polities. Lydia survived by carefully balancing these relationships, sometimes allying with Greek cities, sometimes paying tribute to stronger powers, and occasionally flexing its own military muscle when convenient. The Lydian army was modest but effective. They relied on a combination of native infantry, mercenary forces, and clever use of terrain. Unlike Assyria, they didn't need to terrorize entire regions to maintain control. Strategic fortifications and a well-timed cavalry charge were often enough to defend their core territories. They knew when to fight and, more importantly, when to negotiate, a skill that ensured the kingdom endured even while larger empires ebbed and flowed around them. Economically, Lydia thrived on both agriculture and trade. Farmers cultivated grains and olives, while artisans produced textiles, pottery, and metalwork. The rich river deposits enabled goldsmiths to create objects of remarkable quality, which became both luxury items and tools of political influence. Wealth allowed Lydian kings to sponsor building projects, temples, and armies, signaling stability and authority to both locals and neighbors. Culturally, Lydia absorbed influences from Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and the Aegean. Art and architecture reflected a mix of local styles and foreign motifs. Temples and palaces were centers of religious, administrative, and economic life, blending governance with ritual in ways that reinforced royal legitimacy. Kings often claimed divine favor, using religious imagery to bolster authority, because, after all, surviving in a post-collapse world wasn't just about defense, it was also about perception. The Lydians were also masters of diplomacy. They navigated a complex network of alliances and rivalries. When the Neo-Assyrian Empire pressed westward, Lydia paid tribute strategically, ensuring its autonomy while avoiding direct conquest. Meanwhile, contacts with the Greek city-states opened trade routes, cultural exchange, and eventually mercenary networks, a subtle way to project influence without large-scale warfare. Everyday life in Lydia reflected a society that had learned lessons from the chaos of the previous centuries. Villagers farmed, shepherds moved flocks across hills, artisans crafted goods for both local consumption and export, and merchants moved along well-established trade routes. Political and economic stability allowed culture, religion, and commerce to flourish even while surrounding regions were volatile. By the time of Croesus in the 6th century BC, Lydia had reached its zenith. The kingdom was wealthy, politically savvy, and culturally sophisticated, a model of survival and prosperity in a post-Bronze Age landscape. Croesus' wealth became proverbial, but it was also the product of centuries of careful economic management, strategic alliances, and exploitation of natural resources. Lydia's story demonstrates a recurring theme of the post-Bronze Age world. Smaller kingdoms could thrive not by conquering neighbors, but by leveraging resources, geography, and clever governance. In a region dominated by larger powers, survival required subtlety as much as strength. Lydia shows us that resilience often comes in the form of wealth, diplomacy, and the foresight to play long-term games. As we leave Lydia and drift across the Aegean, we'll see how the Greek city-states were slowly emerging, still small, still fragmented, but beginning to learn lessons from both their Anatolian neighbors and the larger empires that loomed just beyond their horizon. Chapter 14. Early Greek city-states, small, scrappy, and learning fast. Now let's drift across the Aegean Sea to the early Greek world, where a mosaic of small city-states, or polis, was beginning to emerge from the shadows of the Bronze Age collapse. Unlike the centralized empires of Mesopotamia or Anatolia, these were tiny, independent communities, often separated by mountains or islands, and forced to survive on local resources, clever organization, and a healthy dose of stubbornness. The collapse had left Greece fragmented. The great palaces of Mycenae, Pylos, and Tiryns were gone, their bureaucracies and trade networks shattered. Writing largely disappeared for a few centuries, leaving behind only archaeological traces and scattered oral traditions. For the people who remained, survival meant small-scale agriculture, fortification of villages, and localized trade. Mountains became natural barriers, isolating communities but also protecting them from outside powers. By the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, some of these communities began reorganizing into city-states. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and Argos were starting to develop political identities and rudimentary governmental structures. Each polis had its own approach to leadership. Sparta leaned heavily into militarization and social discipline. Athens experimented with oligarchies and, later, early forms of democracy. Corinth focused on trade and naval power. Each city-state reflected the priorities and environment of its people. Life in these early Greek cities was local, slow, and cautious. Farmers grew grains, olives, and grapes, while shepherds moved sheep and goats across rocky terrain. Artisans produced pottery, bronze tools, and weapons. Trade was mostly regional. Goods traveled overland or by sea to nearby islands and coastal settlements. In a post-collapse world, these networks were modest but essential. They allowed communities to survive, share resources, and occasionally acquire luxury goods like Phoenician dye or Anatolian metalwork. Religion remained deeply woven into everyday life. Each city-state had patron gods, Athena for Athens, Apollo in Delphi, Ares and Artemis in various regions, and temples acted as both religious and civic centers. Festivals, rituals, and oracles weren't just spiritual exercises. They reinforced civic identity, promoted social cohesion, and provided opportunities for trade and networking. Religion, in a way, became a survival tool, helping communities maintain unity in a fragmented landscape. The Greeks were also experimenting with military organization. Hoplite warfare emerged during this period, emphasizing citizen soldiers equipped with spears and shields. This system allowed relatively small populations to defend themselves effectively, creating a balance between autonomy and collective security. Instead of relying on massive professional armies like Assyria, Greek city-states could leverage local citizens, fostering a sense of participation and shared responsibility. Politically, these early polis were dynamic and often unstable. Leadership could shift between kings, councils, or oligarchic factions, depending on circumstances. Rivalries between cities were constant, but open warfare was limited by geography and resources. Negotiation, alliances, and occasional raiding were more common than full-scale conquest. Survival required flexibility, local knowledge, and careful diplomacy, lessons learned from centuries of regional instability. Culturally, the early Greek world began reviving literacy and record-keeping. The Phoenician alphabet influenced early Greek writing, leading to the adoption of linear scripts for trade, inscriptions, and literature. Epic poetry, oral traditions, and early myths preserved historical memory and societal values, creating a sense of continuity in a world that had recently lost much of its previous structure. The small size of city-states also fostered social cohesion and competition. Communities were tight-knit, everyone had a role, and innovation spread quickly through contact with neighbors. Unlike large empires, which relied on administration and force, the Greek polis relied on local knowledge, collective effort, and adaptability. In a fragmented post-Bronze Age landscape, that strategy worked surprisingly well. By the end of the 8th century BCE, early Greek city-states were beginning to stabilize. Sparta had built a military society that would endure for centuries. Athens was experimenting with political structures that valued civic participation. Corinth had established maritime trade networks linking Greece with Anatolia and Phoenicia. These cities, small and scrappy, were quietly learning lessons from their neighbors: how to survive, adapt, and thrive in a region where larger empires could loom ominously. In sum, early Greek city-states were a product of the post-collapse world. They were small, localized, and flexible, with social structures, religion, trade, and military organization all geared toward survival and gradual growth. While they would not dominate the region immediately, they were laying the foundations for centuries of cultural, economic, and political influence. A slow, steady recovery from the chaos left behind by the Bronze Age collapse. Next, we can drift northward to Thrace, Macedonia, and the Balkans, where emerging kingdoms and tribal federations were also navigating the post-collapse landscape. Chapter 15. Thrace, Macedonia, and the Balkan tribes, edges of the post-collapse world. Now let's float north, into the rugged hills and forests of the Balkans, the lands of Thrace, Macedonia, and a patchwork of tribal federations. This region was never densely urbanized like Mesopotamia or Anatolia, but it was rich in resources, strategically important, and inhabited by people who had learned early how to survive in a chaotic, post-Bronze Age world. The tribes of Thrace were diverse, scattered across mountains and river valleys, with loosely organized political structures. Unlike the centralized kingdoms to the east, Thracian societies were tribal and clan-based. Leadership was often fluid, based on warrior prestige, familial alliances, and occasional confederations when threats loomed. These societies were remarkably adaptable, small, mobile, and accustomed to both internal rivalries and external pressures from larger neighbors. Macedonia, still emerging from obscurity, occupied a mix of fertile plains and mountainous terrain. Early Macedonian kings, like Perdiccas I and Argeus I, ruled over populations that were partly agricultural, partly pastoral. They were surrounded by powerful neighbors, Thracian tribes, Illyrian groups, and later the Greek city-states, which forced them to develop both diplomacy and military capacity simultaneously. Macedonia's early survival strategy was simple: consolidate territory locally, forge alliances with or pay tribute to stronger neighbors, and cultivate a warrior ethos to deter aggression. Life for ordinary people in Thrace and Macedonia was grounded in the land. Farmers grew grains, olives, and grapes when soil and climate allowed. Shepherds moved flocks across valleys and highlands. Hunters and foragers supplemented their diets with wild resources. Villages were small and often fortified with palisades or natural defenses like hilltops and cliffs. Survival depended on local knowledge, resourcefulness, and the ability to adapt quickly to seasonal and political changes. Trade existed, though more limited than in coastal or riverine regions. Timber, metals, and animal products were exchanged regionally and occasionally traveled along river routes to the Aegean. Thracian gold and silver mines would later become famous, but even in this early period, mineral wealth gave local leaders leverage in diplomacy and alliances. The Balkan tribes had a reputation among neighbors for unpredictability. Assyrian and Greek sources describe Thracians as fierce, independent, and sometimes difficult to control, which was entirely accurate. Their loose social structures meant that no single defeat or conquest permanently subdued them. They could retreat into mountains, regroup, and return when conditions were favorable. This resilience was a defining feature of post-collapse societies in rugged terrain. Religion and ritual were deeply intertwined with daily life. Sacred groves, mountain shrines, and river cults marked the spiritual landscape. Leaders often invoked divine sanction to legitimize authority, and religious festivals reinforced social cohesion. Myth and oral tradition were central, preserving historical memory and cultural identity in the absence of widespread writing systems. Politically, these tribal regions were dynamic. Alliances shifted, confederations formed temporarily in response to threats, and disputes were often resolved through both negotiation and raiding. Unlike empires, which relied on bureaucracy and standing armies, Thrace and Macedonia thrived on flexibility and local autonomy. Success required reading the balance of power constantly, adapting strategies, and knowing when to fight and when to retreat. By the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, Macedonia was slowly consolidating power under its kings, laying foundations for future expansion. Thrace remained decentralized but resilient, capable of influencing events in the Aegean and Anatolia through raids, alliances, and mercenary participation in foreign armies. Both regions illustrate a recurring post-Bronze Age pattern. Survival depended less on conquest than on adaptability, terrain, and local knowledge. These Balkan societies may not have dominated empires immediately, but their resilience ensured they would remain relevant in the shifting political landscape. They could weather pressures from stronger neighbors, contribute mercenaries to distant conflicts, and exploit strategic terrain to maintain autonomy. In a sense, they perfected the art of quiet endurance, a skill that would serve the region well for centuries. In summary, Thrace, Macedonia, and the Balkan tribes occupied the margins of the post-collapse world, yet their role was essential. They were buffers, raiders, allies, and occasionally destabilizers, reminding the great powers that mountains and forests could shelter persistence and unpredictability. Survival here was local, adaptive, and deeply human, a contrast to the centralized, bureaucratic, or militarized strategies of Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Levant. Next, we can drift south again to Egypt and the Nile Delta, exploring how the civilization that had survived the Bronze Age collapse managed continuity, revival, and regional influence. Chapter 16: Egypt Rebuilt, Pharaohs, Floods, and Post-Collapse Persistence. Let's drift south along the Nile, into the lands of Egypt, where the pharaohs were quietly demonstrating that survival after the Bronze Age collapse could take the form of continuity, bureaucracy, and strategic flexibility. Unlike the fragmented city-states of Greece or the rugged highlands of the Zagros, Egypt had a long-standing tradition of centralized administration, monumental architecture, and control over a fertile river valley, advantages that would allow it to endure when so many contemporaries faltered. The Late Bronze Age had been challenging for Egypt. The so-called Sea Peoples raids, combined with internal political instability, economic stress, and climate fluctuations, left the new kingdom somewhat weakened by the 12th century BC. By the early Iron Age, however, Egypt had begun a slow recovery under the Third Intermediate Period pharaohs. The pharaohs still wielded authority, but the empire's reach was diminished, retreating from foreign campaigns in Syria and Canaan and focusing instead on consolidating control at home. Egyptian survival relied on two key advantages: the Nile and administrative continuity. The Nile provided fertile soil, predictable floods, and a reliable food base. Even if trade routes were disrupted or foreign threats loomed, Egypt could feed itself. Meanwhile, the bureaucratic system, with its scribes, regional governors, and tax collectors, ensured that wealth and resources were managed efficiently. The old palaces and temples continued functioning as both administrative hubs and religious centers, blending governance with ritual in a way that reinforced stability. The pharaohs themselves were adapting. Kings like Shoshenq I and later rulers of the 22nd dynasty focused less on expansion and more on internal control, regional alliances, and strategic diplomacy. Nubia to the south, Libyan tribes to the west, and emerging Levantine powers to the northeast required careful management. Egypt's military was no longer projecting empire at the scale of Ramses II, but it remained formidable, capable of protecting borders, suppressing uprisings, and safeguarding trade. Economically, Egypt relied on both agriculture and trade. Grain, flax, and papyrus flowed down the Nile. Artisans produced pottery, jewelry, and finely carved statuary. Trade persisted along the Nile, across the Sinai, and into the Levant. Egyptian ports like Marsa Matruh and Avaris maintained connections with Levantine and Mediterranean traders, including Phoenicians, who were gradually establishing colonies and networks. Survival was a mix of local abundance and selective engagement with the outside world. Religion played its traditional role as a stabilizing force. Temples honored gods like Ammonius, Ra, and Osiris, but they also functioned as economic and administrative centers. Priests were influential in governance, land management, and record-keeping. Rituals reinforced social order and the legitimacy of pharaohs, reminding citizens that, despite the chaos of previous centuries, divine favor still guided the kingdom. Daily life for ordinary Egyptians was, in many ways, similar to centuries prior. Farmers sowed crops along the Nile floodplains, fishermen plied the river, and artisans produced goods for both domestic use and export. Villages and towns were tightly knit, relying on local knowledge, seasonal cycles, and centralized administration to manage resources. The predictability of the Nile, combined with strong cultural continuity, provided a buffer against the broader instability in the region. Politically, Egypt in this period was a study in managed pragmatism. Pharaohs delegated authority to regional governors, often from local elites, ensuring loyalty without overextending the central administration. Foreign policy relied on strategic alliances and tribute rather than aggressive conquest. When necessary, military campaigns were undertaken, but they were limited, precise, and calculated to preserve stability rather than to project imperial ambition. By the 8th and 7th centuries BC, Egypt had re-established itself as a resilient regional power. It was no longer the dominant force in the Near East, but it was stable, resource-rich, and culturally cohesive. Its lessons were clear. Geography, bureaucracy, and cultural continuity could ensure survival in a post-collapse world, even when large-scale military dominance was no longer feasible. Egypt's story contrasts sharply with many smaller post-Bronze Age societies. Where the Greek city-states relied on flexibility and civic cohesion, the Zagros highlands on terrain and local alliances, and Phoenicia on trade and maritime skill, Egypt thrived on predictable resources, centralized administration, and enduring cultural structures. It was a different model of survival, but equally effective. As we leave the Nile Valley, we can drift westward across the Mediterranean to examine the emerging Italic tribes and early Etruscan settlements, small societies quietly adapting to the new realities of the early Iron Age. Chapter 17. Italy's Early Iron Age, Etruscans, Latins, and Survival on the Peninsula. Now let's drift across the central Mediterranean into the Italian peninsula, a patchwork of hills, rivers, and coastal plains where the early Etruscans, Latins, and other Italic tribes were quietly navigating life after the Bronze Age collapse. Unlike the large empires of Mesopotamia or Egypt, these societies relied on local resources, tribal networks, and incremental innovation to survive and slowly grow. The Etruscans were concentrated in what is now Tuscany, Umbria, and northern Lazio. They inherited some aspects of the Bronze Age culture, metallurgy, trade, and urban organization, but had to adapt to a world where centralized palatial power was gone. Etruscan city-states, like Veii, Tarquinia, and Cerveteri, were independent, fortified, and economically interconnected. Unlike the sprawling empires of the Near East, these cities were small but sophisticated, balancing local autonomy with regional cooperation. Etruscan society was hierarchical yet flexible. Kings or magistrates ruled, supported by councils of nobles, but local clans wielded significant influence. Trade, both regional and long distance, was crucial. The Etruscans exported metalwork, pottery, and luxury goods while importing raw materials and finished items from Greece, Phoenicia, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Trade not only brought wealth but also facilitated cultural exchange, helping Etruscan cities maintain relevance despite their relatively modest size. The Latins, inhabiting the area around modern Rome, were smaller, more agrarian, and less urbanized. Villages and fortified settlements dotted the hills, and society was organized around clans and kinship networks. Agriculture, animal husbandry, and small-scale craft production formed the backbone of the economy. Survival relied on local cohesion, adaptable social structures, and occasional alliances or conflicts with neighboring tribes. Military organization in early Italy was pragmatic. Etruscans maintained citizen militias supplemented by mercenary forces when needed. Latins relied on small, mobile units capable of defending their villages and raiding rival settlements. Unlike the professional armies of Assyria or the phalanxes of Greece, these forces were designed for survival rather than conquest. Fortifications, hilltop settlements, and knowledge of the terrain provided natural advantages. Religion was deeply integrated into daily and political life. Etruscans practiced divination, ritual sacrifice, and elaborate funerary practices, which reinforced social hierarchy and cultural identity. Temples and tombs served as both religious centers and expressions of wealth and power, preserving memory and authority across generations. Latins practiced similar customs, blending animistic beliefs with communal rites to maintain cohesion. Trade and cultural exchange played a major role in resilience. Etruscan ports, such as Cosa and Populonia, connected the peninsula with the Mediterranean world. Phoenician and Greek influences filtered in, impacting metallurgy, art, and urban planning. These interactions allowed small Italian societies to adopt innovations, acquire resources, and remain relevant in a wider network of emerging Iron Age powers. By the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, Etruscan cities were consolidating wealth and influence, while the Latins were organizing politically and socially. These societies were small, fragmented, and often overshadowed by larger powers, but their adaptability and focus on local resources, alliances, and cultural continuity ensured their survival. Unlike empires that relied on terror or large-scale administration, survival here was grounded in pragmatism, mobility, and social cohesion. Everyday life for ordinary people involved farming, craftwork, and local trade. Villagers and artisans had to be self-sufficient, but networks of nearby towns and trade connections provided access to goods and opportunities beyond the immediate settlement. Families, clans, and local leaders maintained social stability, ensuring that knowledge, resources, and traditions persisted despite broader regional instability. The Italian peninsula illustrates a recurring theme of the post-collapse world. Survival didn't require empire, monumental architecture, or large armies. Small, organized communities with local knowledge, flexible social structures, and strategic alliances could endure, adapt, and even thrive. Etruscans, Latins, and other Italic tribes remind us that resilience often emerges in modesty, subtlety, and gradual consolidation rather than in grandeur or force. From here, we can drift northward to the Central European Hallstatt culture and Celtic tribes, who were also navigating survival, trade, and social organization in a post-collapse landscape. Chapter 18: Central Europe and the Hallstatt culture, early Celts on the move. Let's drift north into the forests, rivers, and rolling hills of Central Europe, where the Hallstatt culture and early Celtic tribes were quietly emerging from the shadows of the Bronze Age collapse. Unlike the urbanized civilizations of the Mediterranean or Mesopotamia, these societies were rural, dispersed, and heavily influenced by their environment. Yet they were adaptive, resourceful, and surprisingly sophisticated for communities often portrayed as primitive by later writers. The Hallstatt culture, named after an archaeological site in modern Austria, thrived between the 8th and 6th centuries BC. It represented a network of settlements rather than a centralized state. Communities were small, often fortified hilltop settlements, each controlling nearby farmland, forests, and trade routes. Fortifications were simple but effective. Earthworks, palisades, and ditches could deter raiders and rival tribes. Geography, once again, provided both security and a natural limit to conflict. Metallurgy was a hallmark of Hallstatt culture. Iron replaced bronze, though bronze persisted for ceremonial purposes. Weapons, tools, and agricultural implements were produced locally, allowing communities to survive and defend themselves without reliance on distant empires. Iron swords, axes, and plowshares symbolized both practicality and status, and the elite's ability to control these resources reinforced social hierarchies. Trade networks extended beyond Central Europe. Salt, iron, and amber were valuable commodities moving through river systems like the Danube and Rhine. Hilltop settlements controlled access to these resources, collecting tribute or facilitating exchange. This connectivity allowed the Hallstatt communities to prosper economically without requiring the scale or bureaucracy of Near Eastern empires. Social structure was hierarchical but flexible. Elite families controlled settlements and resources, warrior bands enforced authority, and artisans and farmers formed the backbone of daily life. Leadership was often negotiated. Chiefs and kings gained legitimacy through success in trade, warfare, and religious authority rather than through bureaucratic decree. Mobility was key. When conflicts arose, groups could relocate or reorganize without collapsing entirely. Religion and ritual were closely linked to social cohesion. Sacred groves, burial mounds, and ceremonial artifacts marked elite power and community identity. Elite graves often contained weapons, jewelry, and imported goods, highlighting both wealth and connections to wider networks. Rituals reinforced authority, preserved memory, and created cultural continuity in a landscape where centralized record-keeping was rare. Early Celtic tribes were highly mobile and adaptive. They could farm fertile valleys, exploit forest resources, and raid or trade with neighbors as needed. This combination of mobility and local knowledge allowed them to survive environmental fluctuations, population pressures, and occasional incursions from other groups. Unlike empires with fixed borders, Celtic societies thrived in a fluid world, where adaptability was more valuable than territorial control. By the 7th and 6th centuries BC, the Hallstatt culture had developed a recognizable material culture, decorated pottery, distinctive swords and shields, and richly furnished burial sites. Trade with the Mediterranean world brought luxury goods, ideas, and technology, integrating these northern societies into a broader post-collapse network. At the same time, they maintained local traditions, religious practices, and social structures adapted to their environment. Life for ordinary people was a blend of agriculture, craft production, and small-scale trade. Families farmed grains, raised livestock, and harvested forest products. Artisans produced weapons, jewelry, and household items, often influenced by Mediterranean styles but adapted to local needs. Communities were interdependent, with survival relying on cooperation, knowledge of the land, and the ability to respond quickly to external pressures. The Hallstatt culture and early Celtic tribes demonstrate a recurring theme of the post-Bronze Age world. Survival in a fragmented, unpredictable landscape relied on mobility, resource control, flexible social structures, and regional networks, rather than centralized administration or monumental architecture. These northern societies remind us that resilience could take many forms, often quiet, adaptive, and locally grounded, yet capable of influencing broader cultural and economic landscapes over time. From here, we can drift northwest to the emerging Atlantic and Iberian communities, where coastal trade, metallurgy, and maritime skills were shaping early Iron Age societies along the western edges of Europe. Chapter 19: Atlantic and Iberian Communities, Coastal Survival and Early Iron Age Networks. Now let's drift west, along the coasts of the Atlantic and across the Iberian Peninsula, where small Iron Age communities were quietly navigating the post-Bronze Age world. Unlike the centralized empires of Mesopotamia or Egypt, these societies relied on coastal trade, maritime skill, and local adaptability to survive, often existing on the margins of more powerful neighbors yet thriving in their own right. In the Iberian Peninsula, a patchwork of tribal communities had emerged. The Celtiberians, Tartessians, and other regional groups maintained small hill fort settlements, known as castros, perched on defensible ridges. These settlements were typically self-sufficient, combining agriculture, livestock, and metallurgy. Iron and bronze tools allowed efficient farming and artisanal production, while local rivers and the sea facilitated trade and communication. Fortifications were modest but effective, providing protection against raiders and rival communities. Tartessos, in the south, represents a particularly interesting case. Located near the Guadalquivir River, it was a hub of early commerce, metalworking, and cultural exchange. Tartessian elites engaged in trade with Phoenician settlers, importing luxury goods, tools, and writing systems, and exporting silver, tin, and other valuable resources. This interaction created a society that was simultaneously local and connected to a broader Mediterranean network, a survival strategy that combined economic ingenuity with geographical advantage. Along the Atlantic coast, communities relied heavily on maritime resources. Fishing, salt production, and coastal trade provided sustenance and surplus for exchange. Seafaring skills allowed these groups to maintain contact with neighboring regions, exchange goods, and occasionally migrate or raid when environmental or political pressures required. Adaptability was key. Tides, weather, and the rugged coastline shaped settlement patterns, economic practices, and social organization. Social hierarchies were present but flexible. Elite families controlled trade, metallurgy, and land, while farmers, artisans, and fishermen formed the backbone of everyday life. Leadership was often pragmatic and situational. Those who could organize labor, secure resources, or negotiate alliances gained influence. Mobility and local knowledge were as important as inherited authority. Religious and ritual practices reinforced social cohesion. Sacred groves, hilltop shrines, and burial mounds signaled elite power, maintained collective memory, and integrated neighboring communities into shared cultural frameworks. Imported influences, especially from Phoenicians and later Greeks, blended with local traditions, creating hybridized rituals that strengthened both identity and continuity. Trade networks extended across the Mediterranean and along the Atlantic coast. Phoenician traders reached southern Iberia, exchanging metals and goods for local commodities, while Atlantic communities traded salt, fish, and crafted items. These networks were not large empires, but they were resilient and adaptable, allowing small societies to thrive despite political fragmentation and occasional conflict. By the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, these Iberian and Atlantic communities had established patterns of survival that relied on resource control, local autonomy, trade connectivity, and environmental adaptability. They were not monumental civilizations, but they endured. Their legacy includes not just material culture, fortifications, metallurgy, pottery, but also the subtle survival strategies that allowed coastal and inland communities to persist in a post-Bronze Age landscape. Daily life for ordinary people revolved around farming, herding, crafting, and trading. families maintained subsistence while participating in wider networks of exchange. Communities cooperated for defense, resource management, and ritual practice. Flexibility, adaptability, and knowledge of the land and sea were key to persistence, allowing these societies to survive centuries of uncertainty. In summary, the Atlantic and Iberian communities illustrate the varied strategies of survival after the Bronze Age collapse. While empires like Assyria, Babylon, and Egypt relied on centralized control, these Western societies thrived through mobility, trade, local organization, and practical knowledge of their environment. They remind us that post-collapse resilience could be quiet, decentralized, and adaptive, a theme repeated across Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Near East. And with that, we have drifted through the known post-collapse world, from Mesopotamia to the Nile, across Anatolia, Greece, the Balkans, Central Europe, and the Atlantic coasts, observing how societies survived, adapted, and slowly rebuilt. The world after everything fell was chaotic, fragmented, and unpredictable, but it was also full of ingenuity, resilience, and subtle human persistence, the kind that quietly laid the foundations for the Iron Age civilizations to come.